So the next song is called I See Everything, and it stems from a story, something that happened to one of my teachers in high school, one of my favorite teachers, one of the most incredible people I've ever met, who lost a son when she was younger, her first, I think it was her oldest, lost a son to cancer when he was 7 years old. And she told this story to our class one day, kind of unexpectedly, and I think she does it every year to this particular class. And she's an English, I went to a Christian school. She was an English teacher and a religion teacher. And she had like a 0 hour, an early hour one day that was kind of like, I don't know, one of the best classes I've ever taken, even though I was late every day. But that was the class where she talked about it. And that's the whole first scene of that song, is where I literally talk about going to class in the morning and walking in and kind of feeling like when I got there later than everyone, as usual, there's just a different tone to the classroom, just a different vibe, I guess. And she told us this story about, well, she handed, I don't even remember what the ultimate lesson was, or what was the final point she was trying to illustrate. I think it was a lot of things, but she passed out these photocopies of her journal entries that had been published in like a local magazine in Grand Rapids. And she wrote an introduction, and then it was just like entries that she had chosen from her journal about the year and a half that her son was battling cancer. And then she read it out loud, and we talked about it. And I still have the handout. Like that moment has never left me, in the same way that the interaction with Ed at the hardware store and then at his house has never left me. And the thing that's worth noting is that she is one of the most outwardly content people that I've ever met. And it's as soon as you walk into the room, as soon as you share one sentence with her, you get the idea that she has things figured out for herself. She is completely grounded in who she is and what she believes in. And that was something that I always admired and cherished before I knew the story. And then halfway through the year, for her to come out and talk about how, 15 years earlier she had lost a young son to cancer, was pretty awe-inspiring. And then to hear her talk about how difficult it was for her. And I went to a Christian school, and she was a very content Christian person, a good Christian person. I think that has weird connotations to a lot of people because they associate that with President Bush or whatever, Pat Robertson. But she had this unwavering faith, and that's something that I don't know that I'll ever really understand, because I've never been that way. I'm not that way. And that's something that I've always struggled with, and that I haven't come to terms with. But she was always so, like I said, outwardly content. Like, it took you 2 minutes of conversation to be like, this is the happiest person that I've ever met. She loves what she does. She loves being alive. She's so grounded in her faith and in her family and in her occupation that there's no way in hell that this woman has ever wavered, that she's ever lost faith or, had a falling out with anything. And then to hear her talk about losing her son, and then how for a long time after that, she could not justify her existence, and she could not justify putting forth the effort. And she had this huge falling out with God and the world and with her family. And somewhere along the line, she was able to take that situation and come to terms with it and continue moving. And I'm never a person who would say that you have to think of the good when something bad happens. Like, I think that's bullshit. That's the furthest thing from most people's mind when you're going through something like that. Like, you should be angry, and you should be disenchanted, and you should maybe never ever come to terms with that. But in the story, basically there's the introduction, and I talk about that day in class, like getting those handouts, and then her reading it aloud, and then I go through. They're definitely not verbatim, but some of them are completely fictional, and some of them are borrow little things from the entries that she wrote. But kind of what the journal entries more than anything portray is not just less her stability in the situation and more her son's. And that was the most incredible thing about the entire story, was her son, who was 7 years old and was in immense pain and going through treatment and just in this all-around awful situation. He was the one that was the most stable. He was the one that was the most grounded throughout the situation. And it was, it's not a song about faith necessarily. It's not a song that's not a statement about God or religion or anything. But in this particular instance, that was the thing that made this child able to weather that storm for not only himself, but for his whole family. And throughout the journal entries, it talks about him joking with nurses and him talking to his mom, my teacher, about how other people have suffered worse than him. And it ends with him saying, "I see everything," twice before he died. And that comes from pretty specifically, not word for word, obviously, but that whole scene comes from the last journal entry that was in that handout, where, they knew it was his last night, and they knew that he was pretty much gone at that point. It was just in agonizing pain. And at some point in time, he opened his eyes really wide and he shouted, "I see everything, I see everything." And then post that in the journal, she talks about, and I think this was a few days after the actual incident, the actual passing, but she talks about how that was the devil's last attempt to frighten them, to shake them, and to make them lose their faith in not just God, but I think the world and the will to live and the will to continue as you did before you were struck with this thing, when you were unblemished by hardship. And she talks about how her faith helped him, and then also, by association, helped her recover and continue on. And I think part of what made her able to do so was the legacy of her child and the manner in which he conducted himself while he was on his deathbed as a child. And after that, in the song, it kind of goes back to another reflection in the same way that Edward Benz does, where it's the author, or me, depending on how you look at it, talking about how the impression that she left on him and that her child, who had died 15 years before he'd ever met this woman, has left on him. And it talks about that. It talks about like how throughout, I've been through this. It goes back to the same like self-defeating search for purpose, or refusal to search for purpose, this refusal to recover, and where he says basically, you lost your child, and you were able to continue on and become this remarkable individual, and you were able to leave a lasting impression on not just me, but countless other students. And you were able to reconcile your faith, the faith that to you is the thing that gives you purpose. And you were able to preserve that eventually, or recover that, and continue on after this happened to you. And it ends with kind of that final admittance of wrongdoing on his part, with him being like, though I've never suffered through something that came even remotely close to losing a child, I don't see anything, And then the last line is, though I felt nor what he did, my eyes are closed. And it just kind of takes that last situation in which this child, who is crippled with pain and seconds from death, says, "I see everything." And he, so far from that, refuses to even look for anything, refuses to look for a way out, because he's so absorbed with that self-hate and that defeatist perception of his own reality. It's from the journal entry and then reworded, but she talks about how awful the death was, that final moment of passing, how difficult it was for her, and how much more difficult it was than any of the process before, any treatment or anything, where he was just in absolutely agonizing pain to the point where it was visible, where he was tossing and turning and was, this tiny little boy just ravaged by cancer. And she says that though his death was ugly, we can't let it scare us away from living and from our faith, the thing that gives us purpose. So that it was the devil trying to shake their faith one last time, is how she put it. But I think the biggest thing that helped her reconcile the situation was the way that her son conducted himself throughout this, like you said, a 7-year-old boy who's able to, while in the hospital receiving chemotherapy and dying from cancer, acknowledge that there are other people in the world who are suffering as well. And that the impact that that had on her. But like you said, that's obviously something that stems at least partially from the way that he was raised and from his mother and father. So it's kind of this train of influence. And I think it's really remarkable. And then how that carries on to, I think, all the people in the room who heard the story. I mean, obviously it stuck with me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that it has.